Hello, everybody. This information is for advanced placement language and composition students. This is some helpful hints to let you know how some ways, some strategies that you can improve your style by avoiding some problematic phrases and looking at some alternatives to those phrases. So let's go ahead and get started. The first three we're going to talk about here are right here: in life, in the world, in society. Those are what I call throwaway phrases because where else does anything happen besides in life, in the world, in society? We hear these used in conversation quite a bit, and you know they're sort of like verbal pauses. They give us a little bit of time to think about what we're saying, but in writing they don't really contribute anything, and actually they kind of detract from the meaning. So you know, something happens in life. Well, when else does it happen? So just if you see in life, then just scratch it out. It probably doesn't contribute anything. In the world, again, same kind of thing. Let's talk about in society for just a minute, because that's a pretty special one. That's why I have my little guy here, you know, screaming that society is so corrupt. The word society or in society is often associated with a really sweeping generalization, which is a logical fallacy, and we don't want to include those in our writing or in our thinking. When people say society is so corrupt, what they're really doing is creating the logical fallacy of a sweeping generalization. And I see this in student writing sometimes. They'll say, you know, the author is trying to demonstrate how corrupt society is. Well, that kind of says that everybody is corrupt, because what is society? We have specific societies, we have smaller societies, we have groups of people we can identify as a particular society, and that's okay if we want to identify those smaller groups and be more specific. But just to say society is corrupt is to say that every single person in the world is corrupt, and it sort of gives us the idea that at some point society wasn't corrupt, when we know there's been corruption throughout history. There have been good people and bad people throughout history. So we really need to zero in and fine-tune our arguments and not use these big sweeping generalization phrases like in society or society is a certain way. Well, what elements of that society? That's what we really want to focus on. All right, there's the first one. And many more, or and much more. It's something that I see in advertising a lot, right? Advertisers like to give us these ideas, or they throw a promise out there, or what we think is a promise about their product, and we say it does this, it does that, and much more, and it sort of leaves us to fill in the blanks. Our goal as good writers is to be honest and transparent and complete, and to finish the idea rather than to leave it unfinished. The unfinished claim is a strategic way for advertisers to think we're getting more than we really are with their products. So we hear those advertisements day in, day out, so it kind of finds its way into our everyday language. And we don't want to put that into our analysis language that we're using in our essays or in any writing for that matter. And so we want to fill in the blanks. So we want to say, what is that much more? If we're going to list things, let's make that list complete rather than giving a few examples and then saying and many more and sort of leaving the listener or the reader to finish that thought for us. We want to finish our thoughts for ourselves. All right, so we want to avoid that kind of language, and we want to move on to one of my favorites, and that is the word constantly. And really, literally, the word constantly means nonstop. When we speak in casual conversation, very often we use hyperbole. We exaggerate things to create emphasis. And the problem is that writing is taken much more literally than speaking is. And that there are a lot of reasons for that. The physical context of speaking. We know that people are exaggerating, or if we think they're exaggerating, or if we're not quite sure, we can ask them face to face what's going on there. We can clarify those arguments, but with writing, we can't really do that because of the physical situation. When we're writing, our audience is very often in a different time, in a different place, and we don't have that immediate feedback opportunity. So the word constantly is a word that is often misused. And constant means, again, nonstop. And here's some examples. A heartbeat is constant. The world is constantly spinning. The sun is shining. The tides are rising and falling. Those are all constant actions. But if we want to really be accurate with our language, we can use phrases like this or words like this: frequently, often, oftentimes, consistently, regularly, periodically, chronically. There are lots of different ways to convey the message of something that happens on a regular basis, or that happens seemingly constantly, but it's not really constantly. The word consistently is actually usually a lot more accurate than constantly. So this is one that I see in student writing quite a bit, and it is almost always not used accurately. So let's be careful about that. All right, the word obviously, and here we have our girl there with her her eye rolling, and that's kind of what the word obviously does. We again, obviously, like a lot of words, it's kind of a verbal pause. It's something we say to give ourselves a little bit of time to think. But again, we're not speaking, we're writing, and you have all the time in the world to formulate your thoughts and to write things. And when you say obviously at the beginning of a phrase, I kind of wonder, well, if it's obvious, why do we have to explain it? So it's not really obviously. You don't really mean that something is obvious. You're probably thinking of something else, but obvious is not the word you're thinking of. So the part of the problem with obvious is that it changes the tone of your writing, and it sounds a little arrogant, and there's some eye rolling going. Well, obviously I know this, so I'm so smart and you're not, is kind of the feel that it gives your writing, and we don't want to do that with our writing. So try to avoid the word obviously. It sounds a little insulting and condescending, and we really don't want to have that attitude in our writing. So be careful about the word obviously. Okay, the word have is, it's not always a bad word to use, but it's often overused, and it's probably as I say here, the most generic or dead verb in the English language. And a lot of times we just get lazy and kind of throw that word in there when we have so many other verb choices to use. And using lively, vivid, action, observable verbs is always preferable to using state of being verbs or these sort of lifeless verbs that are just sort of there to hold the place. So we look at our examples here. The author wants to have the audience to respond. Well, that conveys the idea on the surface, but let's color that in a little bit and use some more accurate language. The author wants to encourage the audience to respond. Now see how that kind of gives your sentence a lot more life, and it doesn't make you sound lazy. I mean, the word have is kind of a lazy verb. I'm going to have you turn your paper in tomorrow. I'm going to allow you to turn your paper in tomorrow. Okay, so that means something different than have. I'm going to allow you to turn your paper. Not that this is the ideal situation, but you see the difference between these two verbs and how they have different meanings. So try to avoid the word have. As you're writing, as you're doing your drafts, it's okay to put in a verb like that because you're trying to get your ideas across. But in one of your revision situations, in your peer editing sessions and that sort of thing, you might want to just look for the word have and ask yourself, is there a better verb I can use besides the word have? Besides just, going for the low-hanging fruit and going for the obvious, let's go for something that's going to get our ideas across a lot more accurately. Starting a sentence with these words: there are, there were, there will be, there was. Any kind of a situation in which we have there plus a state of being verb, especially at the beginning of a sentence, it really takes away from the style of your paper, the accuracy, and the efficiency of your writing. Because if you think about it, the most important part of any sentence is the subject and the verb, right? And that connection between the subject verb, the relationship between the two. And if you're going to throw in there are as the first two words of any sentence, it kind of eats up that subject and verb position with some dead words. They don't really contribute anything. And so this seems like a simple example, and if you do it once in your writing, it's not going to hurt a whole lot. But if you get into the habit of there are, at the beginnings of lots and lots of different sentences, it can create a problem. So again, one of your revision strategies ought to be to go through and just look at the beginnings of every sentence and see where we see the words "there are," and see if we can't change the focus to the actual subject matter of the sentence by getting rid of that. And then you can see these sentences. This one's longer, so it's got some dead wood in it. It's got some words that don't contribute, so you can be more concise and more accurate if you get rid of "there are." There are a large population of Bosnian people living in St. Louis. Well, first of all, it's a subject-verb agreement. Are is a verb, and a population is singular. I'm sorry, are is plural, population is singular, so we can't have that disagreement going on. But if we do this, a large population of Bosnian people lives in St. Louis, it makes it a lot more accurate, okay? So we're going to work on those kinds of strategies as we work through the semester. Let's take a look at another one of my favorites, the word literally. Oh my goodness, that has become such a popular word for people to use in casual conversation. And when they say it, they almost always use it inaccurately. Literally, I did something, and if you think about, wait a minute, literally means really, truly, actually, without exaggeration. It means the words mean exactly what they say when you say something happens literally. So, I hear people say this kind of thing on a pretty regular basis. The basketball team we played last night, those guys were literally 10 feet tall. No, they were not, or they would be in the Guinness Book of World Records. Or, something really terrible happened and you were so embarrassed last night, and you could say, oh my gosh, last night I literally died from embarrassment. Well, if you literally died last night, you would not be alive to tell the story. So we have to be very careful about using this word literally. Again, it's a verbal pause. It's one of those words we throw in when we're trying to think of what to say. It gives us about a half a second to formulate our thoughts. So anyway, let's just try to avoid the word literally. There are so many other words you can use than literally, and again, most of the time it's not used correctly. So be careful about that one. All right, another one that really kind of creates a logical fallacy. Nowadays, back then, the old days, and during that time, and any phrase that sort of falls into that category. First of all, when you say nowadays, again, it almost sets you up for a logical fallacy, because it sort of leaves your reader with the notion that now something is true, and any time other than now or any time before now, it was not true, not ever, not under any circumstances, and that today is so much different from at a previous time period. And rarely is that true. History does repeat itself. We have lots of things that we have today, and we assume just because they happen today, they didn't happen at some previous time. But for the most part, most of the things that are happening today were happening at another time, maybe in a different form, maybe in a different way. We want to also avoid the phrase back then. And so back when is what I'm asking, when people just say, well, back then, and they just assume that we all know what time period we're talking about. Let's be specific about our time period. So back when? Back in the 1960s? Are we talking about the Civil Rights Movement? Are we talking about the Civil War? Are we talking about revolutionary times? Are we talking about the Normandy invasion? I mean, in some people's minds, there are two time periods. There is now and there is back then, or there's now and there's the old days, or during that time. And it's this really vague, generic way of conveying a thought, and you can make your information a lot more accurate by avoiding these kinds of things. There is no such historical era called the old days or back in the day. That's another one that people like to use. People they create phrases like, nowadays kids don't appreciate what they have. Well, it sort of assumes that at some point in history, kids were all appreciative of everything they had, but that doesn't happen anymore. Again, that's a big sweeping generalization. I'm sure that in the 1700s, there were spoiled kids who didn't appreciate what they have. And I'm sure now there are lots of kids who appreciate what they have. So when we preface our statements with nowadays, it kind of lends itself. It really sets you up for a sweeping generalization and sets you up for a logical fallacy. So we want to make sure our thinking is critical and that our language reflects that. All right, here's another one. Just a few kind of stylistic things, and there's a whole list here. Something that people like to do in casual conversation, they say, I'm going to try and do something, when it should be try to. I'm going to try to do something. I'm going to try and. I don't know, somebody started saying that, and somebody else thought it was a good idea, and it just sort of caught fire and took off, and now most people say this instead of the proper form. So this is just an idiomatic expression that has kind of taken a life of its own. Use try to instead of try and. The word plethora it really means too much. And this is a word that I think every college freshman or senior writing student thinks, oh, if I'm at this level now, I must use the word plethora. It's almost like an obligation that they have to use that word. But they almost always use it inaccurately. Plethora means too much. It means a glut of something. It means it's overflowing because there's so much. So if you say, hey, I have a plethora of ideas about how we can do, no, you have a lot of ideas. You have several ideas. But plethora, it just sounds like such a fancy, impressive word. But honestly, if you use that word, you're going to sound like every other freshman who thinks it's a cool word to use. And it's kind of like a red flag for freshman English teachers. They're like, oh gosh, here we go again, plethora. We're going to have a talk with this kid, right? Okay, the word countless can be a problem, because a lot of times when people use the word countless, they mean a lot of something. But if it can be counted, it's not countless. So the stars in the sky are countless because we can't possibly count them all. Grains of sand on the beach are countless because we can't possibly count them. But if you say that Albert Pujols has hit countless home runs, that's not an accurate statement, because we know exactly how many home runs he's hit. It's a matter of record. Or if something happens a lot, don't again go into hyperbole and say that it's countless, thinking that it has more impact. No, it just makes it less accurate. Okay. The word utilize, again, is not a bad word to use. It's just that it means exactly the same thing as the word use. So there's really nowhere in the English language that the word use can be used without that. Or back up here a second. The word utilize can be used that the word use cannot also be used. So people use the word utilize thinking they're being fancy, or they sound impressive, but most of the time, use is pretty vague. It's pretty generic. It's not very accurate, and neither is the word utilize. The fact that it has 3 syllables instead of 1 doesn't make it any more accurate. So be careful about those words. All right, phrases that beg the question. What she did, how he felt, why he acts the way he acts. Those are all phrases that beg the question. In other words, when people use these phrases, they're assuming that their listener or their reader knows what she did. Rather than saying what she did, explain what did she do. Don't say, I'm angry at her because of what she did. Say, I'm angry at her because she took $5 out of my wallet without asking. So now we have real information rather than just assuming that everybody knows what she did or how he felt. The author uses this powerful language with lots of negative connotations because of how he felt. Well, how did he feel? Explain that. And the same thing with this example, why he acts the way he acts. First of all, we don't know why he acts that way. And secondly, we don't know the way he acts. Explain how he acts. Okay, so this is a vague language that's used in politics a lot. I'm going to vote for Fred because of what he stands for. Okay, what does he stand for, right? It's sort of, that's why I say it's begging the question. You're just waiting for somebody else to fill in the blanks, but you're the writer. You're the one who has to fill in those blanks. Make sure there are no blanks. The reader knows why he did what he did. Okay, explain why and explain the what. There's a whole lot of sort of fill in the blank kind of mentality going on there, and we make our writing and our style a whole lot more accurate, and we make our information come across a lot better if we don't leave those blanks in our writing. Again, the big problem there is that most of the time when we have problems with writing, it's because we're incorporating a spoken convention into our writing, and speaking and writing are kind of like two different languages on a lot of levels. So don't throw in our casual conversation style into your formal writing, and this is a really good example of how that works. Oh, another one of my favorites, the word normal. Normal is a relative term, and what that means is that it means something different for everyone who uses it. What's normal for me is probably not normal for you. If I'm a middle-aged guy, a middle-aged teacher, whatever, and what's normal for me is probably not normal for a teenager. So if I throw out the word normal, I'm using it according to my point of reference, not according to yours. So I would just not use the word normal at all. I would be much more specific about that. And again, here at the bottom, it says more about the person using it than it does about the subject. I don't like this person because he's not normal. Well, okay, what is normal anyway? That we all get to define that according to our own sense of what we think is normal, and it doesn't really have any place in formal writing. So again, it's a little bit lazy, I would say, to throw out the word normal rather than to really explain what you mean. Let's move on to this phrase here. Now, there's a really good way to make your style sound mature and on a college level. And this phrase here is kind of a red flag that says, I'm not really ready for college writing. You're adding more information, you're adding more examples, and you say, not only that, but, okay, kind of you're setting yourself up for a fragment if you do that to begin with. But a word that means the same thing as not only that, but is moreover. You can use the word moreover or all these other examples we have here. Additionally, besides, and these have slightly subtle differences in meaning, but they all kind of are those transition words that show relationships among the ideas rather than just sort of this conversational form, not only but also, or not only that but, sorry. Moreover is a word that people don't use very often, and of course I wouldn't use it too much. You don't want to overuse any word too much, but moreover is a word that allows you to add information that supports your idea without sounding like you're not quite ready for college writing. All right, let's move on to another sort of an empty phrase or an empty word, affect, affect, impact. They're too general, they're too abstract, they're empty, especially when they're used in the following ways. And this is particularly in the context of AP language writing. You're analyzing a piece and you create a sentence like this: the author uses powerful diction to affect the reader. Well, that's kind of stating the obvious, isn't it? I mean, it's like saying water is wet. Authors do just about everything they do to affect the reader in some way. Same thing with the word impact. The author impacts the audience. So don't just say the author affects or impacts or has an effect upon the audience, but what is that effect? What's the author trying to do? Another phrase that kind of falls into the same category is gets the reader's attention. Well, the author likes to get the reader's attention in lots of different ways. So don't say, the author uses onomatopoeia to grab the reader's attention. It's just not specific enough. And looks like my frame got cut off here. But why is the author trying to grab the reader's attention? The author uses onomatopoeia to grab the reader's attention. So let's think of what we can do besides grab the reader's attention. The author uses onomatopoeia in the line thunk, thunk, thunk to describe and recreate the feeling that he gets every time he walks in front of a car and the people inside the car are afraid of him, so they're locking their doors. And it reminds him of that the effect that he's, sorry, I said effect, but the, how they're feeling when he appears because they're afraid of him. So this is specifically for the essay, Black Men in Public Spaces. So that's one example. We want to make sure that we say why the author and in what capacity and to what effect is the author grabbing the reader's attention, or what is that effect? Be more specific. And that be more specific is really sort of the blanketing phrase that you can put on any of these ideas. All right, so finally, this is it. This is how we're going to finish this whole video today, and the most important ideas are be specific. I keep telling my students every year, I wish I had a rubber stamp that said be specific, because that's the one comment I put on student papers more than anything else. Because if you're just sort of hovering in abstraction and leaving things unfinished and not being specific, you're just sort of pointing people in a certain direction but not really giving them specific directions, and the information is not going to be as useful. Being specific is also a good way to get development into your writing. If you're staring at that blank sheet of paper, that blank computer screen, and you're wondering, how am I going to fill this up? I've got a 15-page paper to write and I've only got 7 pages. Oh my gosh, what do I do now? Go back and make sure your examples are more specific. Make sure your language is more specific. Consider your audience. If you're throwing out generalizations and abstractions, you're not really considering your audience. You're not thinking about the quality of the information you're trying to create or convey, and your audience is going to be left with kind of an empty experience. You want to make sure your audience has a valuable experience and your audience walks away from your paper with being able to do or think or create or something other than just looking at the paper and walking away thinking, well, there's 10 minutes of my life I'll never get back. Okay, make sure you use accurate, precise language that captures genuine meanings. Precise language. I like to think about this. The analogy I like to use is like a microscope, right? You can see something at a certain level just by looking at it with the naked eye. You look at it through a microscope, you're going to get a very different view of what that thing is all about. You start dialing in the microscope and you start looking at more and more and more fine-tuned views of the thing you're looking at. You're going to see a whole different world. And a lot of times when people write, they write as if they're just viewing something with the naked eye and not really zeroing in on all of its individual components. And that's really one of the goals of good, accurate writing, is to make sure we're precise, we're fine-tuning our words. That doesn't mean using big fancy words or flowery diction. A lot of people like to think that, gosh, the more multisyllable words I use or the more unusual words I use, the smarter I'm going to sound. And again, we don't want you to sound smart. We want you to be smart. We want you to convey ideas accurately rather than just trying to confuse people with words they don't know the meanings of. All right, complete the idea. Again, the same thing. Avoid abstractions, avoid generalizations, fine-tune, be specific, and then show, don't tell. Provide examples and support. Don't just tell people that the author uses imagery, but explain, give examples, quotes, write down the specific words that the author uses, and what is that imagery and what is the effect of that imagery on the audience, and how does it fit into the entire whole of the piece, and how does it help the author further his or her purpose. Okay, so that's just a few of the basic things we want to take a look at with AP language, and some tips to hopefully help you figure out how to formulate your responses without sounding like you're just hovering at the surface.